righty. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for hopping on with us on a Friday afternoon to talk about the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. We're going to go through the process. We are going to walk through the general guidance related to the extension, as well as do a demo of the submission tool for both the ESSER 3 formula grants as well as other ESSER 3 discretionary grants. This is a webinar, so you will be able to put your questions in the Q&A function. I should have some time at the end to answer any questions. Hopefully I'll be able to address most of y'all's questions during the slides that we'll share here shortly. But as questions arise throughout the presentation, you can stick them in the Q&A section of the webinar. So into everything, I am Nick Davis. I'm the Department Chief of Staff for TEA's Department of Grant Compliance and Administration. So this is our legal disclaimer. This is the best guidance that we currently have regarding the ESSER 3 liquidation extension process. If you have any questions about any content today, please consult with your local legal guidance, as we are not attorneys. This is not legal guidance, so if you have any questions, please consult your local legal guidance. So we're going to start at the top here with program reminders for ESSER 3. We want to kind of go through just some general reminders about allowability of costs related to ESSER 3, and then we'll jump into the specifics of the ESSER 3 liquidation extension process, as well as the tool that districts, service centers, and other grantees will fill out related to ESSER 3. So remember, it's important to remember the allowability of ESSER 3 activities. So any allowable use of funds that is charged to ESSER must be reasonable and necessary, must meet the intent of ESSER, which is to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus pandemic and its impact on students and staff. And also it must align to an allowable activity in statute. So all the things that we talked about throughout the life cycle of ESSER 3 still holds true as we jump into the liquidation extension period here for ESSER 3. You still must ensure that any ESSER 3 activity that you are charging to the grant still is meeting these three criteria. You must also remember that you still have to tie back to the intent of ESSER 3, which was, again, preventing, preparing for, and responding to the pandemic and its impact on students and staff. So you still have to meet the intent of ESSER, and you must still tie back to that, as it is still important and still critical when you're determining the overall allowability of what you're charging to ESSER 3, as well as things that are going to potentially be covered under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension that's being offered by the Department of Education. You just need to still continue to be mindful of all of the allowable uses that tie back to the pandemic, that tie back to an allowable activity in statute, and still ensuring that those costs are ultimately reasonable and necessary. Further, we will talk about this more in depth here, but this is from 34 CFR 76.707. So this is from Edgar, when an obligation is made with federal education funds. So September 30th was the end of the performance period for ESSER 3. All funds had to have been properly and legally obligated by September 30th. That is why, when we'll talk shortly about what is covered under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension, that only certain contracted services are permissible to be extended under the liquidation extension. And it is ultimately because of this citation here from Edgar, where things such as payroll and travel and various other things are not able to be obligated to ESSER 3, but contracted services where you had a properly obligated contract executed by September 30th could be subject to the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. And we'll talk about that, but kind of important to frame this around that really important date that we talked about for a long time, which was September 30th, because you had to have things properly and legally obligated by that particular time, because you are not able to obligate funds towards ESSER 3 at this point. You are merely liquidating things that have been properly and legally obligated by September 30th. So we put out this letter, this to the administrator addressed letter, on June 27th of 2024. This letter here is still out there. When you get a copy of the slides, the title slide here will link you directly to that TAA letter. This letter in particular addresses closeout considerations for ESSER 3. It addresses the standard liquidation period for ESSER 3, which we will touch on here shortly. It talks about the ARP ESSER liquidation period, and it'll jump about and talk about liquidation extension as well. And it also talked about a limited extended service prepayment of cost flexibility that is also still in that particular letter. So this letter guidance and the instructions that are in this letter still are the guidance and instructions, and we're really going to be kind of digging in to things that were said in this particular letter today. But I would really encourage you to go back and take a look at this particular letter and look at just overall closeout for ESSER 3 as we're in that currently in the 90-day standard liquidation period for ESSER 3. Would recommend that you take a look and reference back to this letter that our department put out in June. So now we're going to dig into the liquidation extension under ESSER 3. So the Department of Education has offered a 14-month extension that is in addition to the 120-day liquidation period. That 120-day liquidation period, 90 days of that is reserved for LEAs. The other 30 days is reserved for TEA to do statewide closeout. This liquidation extension is 14 additional months. So you'll see in some of the federal guidance that they will talk about 18 months. When they're talking about the 18 months, they are talking about that in totality with the 4 months plus the additional 14 months, giving you 18 months in total. But this extension period allows you to continue to receive and pay for goods and services that were properly obligated by September 30th and are applied for under the liquidation extension for ESSER 3. It's important to note here that the liquidation extension does not cover all types of costs. As I talked about previously, looking back at the when an obligation is made table that is in EDGAR, certain costs are not able to be covered under the liquidation extension. So some common examples: indirect costs, staff salary, and travel, because the obligation for those is defined very particularly in 34 CFR 76.707, and as a result of that, you cannot obligate funds, so those are not subject to the liquidation extension. So really, when we get into talking about what is subject to the ESSER 3 liquidation extension, what we're really talking about is contracts for goods and services, is really what we're generally talking about and what we've seen the most under both the extension under ESSER 1 as well as ESSER 2. It's contracted goods and services. The agency is going to request the extension for 14 additional months after the standard liquidation period. This will take that period and extend it until February 28th of 2026. We will ask for 14 months across the board. We're not going to say that LEA X needs 8 months, this LEA needs 4 months. We ask for the total 14 months, and we give you that flexibility during that liquidation extension period. And the state applies on behalf of districts. So as we talk about the submission and the information that we need, the state takes all that information, we submit it to the Department of Education on behalf of LEAs across the state, and then we will notify LEAs who applied for the liquidation extension of if they are approved under from the U.S. Department of Education on that. So LEAs do not apply to Department of Ed directly. TEA collects information, and then the state submits that to the Department of Education. So it's important, again, here when we look at ESSER 3, there are more ARP-funded grants that are not just the ARP ESSER 3 formula grants. You have ARP Homeless, you have certain things under T-Class that are federally funded, and then there are other ESSER 3 funded projects. And so those projects, as well as ESSER 3 formula grants, are subject to the liquidation extension. And then when I do the demo here shortly, I will go through 2 different dynamic views that we have set up in the ESSER compliance work app, one of which is for the ESSER 3 formula grants, in which we pre-populated some information. The other is one for discretionary projects, which includes ARP Homeless, E-Class, and then those other ESSER 3 funded projects as well fall under that discretionary project dynamic view that I'll show shortly. So this is not just limited solely to the formula grants under ESSER 3. This also applies to other ARP-funded projects that TEA helped administer. So who should request the liquidation extension? So it's any LEA who legally obligates ESSER 3 funds by September 30th of 2024, and you have portions of those funds for distinct types of contracted services that will not be fully liquidated, which means you will not receive and those costs will not be paid. So this is really what needs to be extended, is the portion of those contracted services in which your LEA does not and is not able to draw down within the standard 90-day liquidation period. Those particular costs are what you want to extend under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension process. And so not every LEA across the state is going to need to do this, but some LEAs who have those properly obligated contracts will need to potentially apply for the liquidation extension to allow them to have time to be able to continue to receive and pay for those goods and services during that extended timeline. When we talk about the liquidation extension, you must be able to provide and describe the contracted service and an acceptable justification needed for the extension. Needing more time to extend funds is not a permissible or allowable justification. The Department of Education is very clear on that. But some allowable justifications include supply chain delays, delays in receiving services, procurement delays, and I'll talk when I go through the demo, I'll show you the various different justifications that we've received from the Department of Education that are generally allowable as a justification for why an LEA needs the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. So when we look at the timeline of ESSER 3 with the liquidation extension, so you had your ESSER 3 grant period, which ran from March 13th of 2020 to September 30th of 2024. This was your period of performance for ARP ESSER 3. It's important, and again, we'll talk about this quite a bit in this webinar, which is that funds had to have been properly and legally obligated by September 30th. Then we're currently in our ESSER 3 liquidation period. You often maybe will hear us say the standard liquidation period under ESSER because ESSER is a little different and has this liquidation extension possibility for LEAs to apply for it. And that's 120 days in total, 90 of which LEAs receive, 30 of which TEA receives again to do statewide closeout, and that is the liquidation period. But then you have the liquidation extension period, which generally runs from January 30th of next year to February 28th of 2026 for LEAs. TEA still has 30 days included in that liquidation extension, so you will only have until February 28th of 2026 to draw down on those costs that are allowable under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. And so again, in total, it is 18 months to liquidate, both under the standard liquidation, which lasts for 4 months, plus the additional 14 months under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. And again, we did put out the information regarding the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. We put the tool out in June to allow for planning. I know that some of y'all may still be kind of trying to understand kind of how much you're fully going to draw down on by a particular point. And that is going to come up when we demo the actual smart sheet, as it's very date specific as to what information we are going to need to be able to submit this to the Department of Education. But we put it out early because we generally anticipate there will be more LEAs needing to utilize the liquidation extension for ESSER 3, just given the amount of funds that are currently remaining across the state. So what does it mean to liquidate funds? So liquidation is the drawing down and expenditure of funds by grantees for obligations that were incurred during the grant's legal obligation period. So it's that legal obligation, and then the liquidation is the drawing down and expenditure of those legal obligations. Timely obligation occurs during the performance period and through the first, again, that 120 days of which LEAs retain 90, TEA retains the remaining 30, and in the final day of that period or an extension of that period authorized by the Department of Education. And so, again, liquidation is the drawing down and the expenditure of those particular funds. When we talk about the liquidation extension period, we often get asked, what can I do during that particular liquidation extension period and during the current standard liquidation, the 90-day liquidation period that we're currently in. And you will continue to receive and pay for goods and services that were, again, properly and legally obligated by September 30th. That September 30th date is incredibly important. You need to really revisit and ensure that all of your funds were properly and legally obligated by September 30th, because you are no longer able to obligate funds to your ESSER 3 grants because we are past the end of the performance period. And so again, this last part here is that you have to have made a timely and valid obligation pursuant to 34 CFR 76.707. So that chart I showed earlier has to be pursuant to that, as the EDGAR regulations on when an obligation is made apply to your federal education grants. And so that defines when that actual obligation occurs. When we're talking about things, contracts that are subject to the liquidation extension under ESSER 3, we're generally expecting a signed executed contract or agreement where we can see that it was properly executed and validly obligated by September 30th of this year to be subject to the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. So that September 30th date is really important here as we look forward at folks that are thinking about applying for the liquidation extension. You must ensure that the obligation did occur on or before September 30th of this year. So when we go back and we look at the when an obligation is made table from EDGAR, really we're looking at about 3 different kind of broad areas in which we generally think that these are things that are allowable to continue and be permissible under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. So the first one is acquisition of real or personal property, and the obligation for that real or personal property is on the date of which the subgrantee made a binding written agreement to acquire the property. That binding written commitment portion there is what's really vital, and that binding written commitment had to have occurred on or before September 30th for it to be a valid and legal obligation for your ESSER 3 grant. Then you have C and D. So C is personal services by a contractor who is not an employee of the subgrantee. Again, that's on the date in which you have made that binding written commitment to obtain the services. And then D is performance of work other than personal services. Again, that is on the date of which the subgrantee made a binding written commitment to obtain the work. And again, generally for these 3 highlighted sections here, we're generally expecting from a documentation perspective to be able to verify with you from your records that you had a binding written executed contract or an agreement of some sort that is legal and binding, that made the actual legal valid obligation of those particular funds. Again, most of the time we're seeing executed contracts or agreements that are signed by both parties to substantiate and show us that there was a valid and legal obligation of those funds made. But these 3 sections are generally what is generally going to be subject to liquidation extension under ESSER 3. So when we look at the information that the state will need for the ESSER 3 liquidation extension, we'll actually go through the live smart sheet here shortly, but I think this is a little bit more of a zoomed in version of what we're going to need from LEAs across the state to be able to submit that to the Department of Education. So we're starting kind of reading left to right here. The first is the allocation total. That's your NOGA amount. We pre-populate your NOGA amount for your ESSER 3 formula grant. We have also adjusted those NOGA amounts to reflect any LEAs who got during the reallocation process we just conducted for ESSER 3, asked for additional money. Under that, we have increased your grant award to reflect that reallocation of those ESSER 3 formula funds. So you will see that reflected there. Then you're going to have the amount obligated by September 30th of 2024. And this is the amount of your award that was properly obligated by September 30th of 2024. This is things that were validly and legally obligated. You're going to put a dollar amount here indicating all of your funds that have been properly and legally obligated. Then you're going to see the amount liquidated as of November 15th. This is the amount that you have expended by November 15th of this year. That's the dollar amount that's going to go in there. We often get asked, because you still do have time to continue to liquidate after you submit the ESSER 3 liquidation extension tool, do I factor in additional drawdowns that I know that my LEA is going to make? And ultimately, we generally guide and say, yes, if you're sure you're going to make that drawdown by December 28th, by the end of that standard liquidation period, yes, you can include that here. But if you're unsure, it's better to go a little bit lower to give yourself that flexibility if for some reason you don't make that drawdown by the end of that standard liquidation period. It gives you that flexibility. Then you'll see the percentage liquidated as of November 15th is automatically calculated in the Smartsheet, and then the balance remaining as of November 15th also calculates automatically in Smartsheet. And then you're going to see the amount of obligated funds necessitating the extension. So this is out of that remaining balance that shows as of November 15th, what is the amount that you need to be extended, again, for those properly obligated contracted services. So in this example here, we can see that the LEA got $1 million grant award. They fully obligated all of their grant award. They liquidated $850,000 of their grant award by November 15th, meaning they've liquidated 85%, leaving $150,000 that is a remaining balance. And from this example, the LEA is asking for all of those funds to be under the liquidation extension, again, for those properly obligated contracted services. Then following that, you're going to see a lot of narrative and justification questions related to your ESSER 3 liquidation extension. The first is, again, that amount of obligated funds that are needing the extension. So that's that dollar amount that you're going to need under that 14-month liquidation extension period with ESSER 3. Then you're going to see use of funds. So some examples might include construction contract, HVAC contract, instructional services contract, delayed materials and supplies, or for other allowable uses. As we go through the tool here shortly, you will see that there is an option for other, in which you're able to put in what that other allowable use is. And as we review these, we will make a determination and talk to you potentially if there are questions that we have about that particular use of funds related to the extension. Again, all funds must have been properly obligated by September 30th and for allowable uses under ESSER 3. Your requests must be aligned to particular projects or specific circumstances at your district level. And so again, you have to understand that there is a justification needed beyond we just need more time. There has to be additional justification for why these funds that you're stating necessitate the extension. What is the justification to extend those funds with the U.S. Department of Education? So again, when we get into justification, needing more time is never going to be an adequate justification for these liquidation extension requests. But some examples might include delays related to supplier labor shortages, procurement delays. There's an option for services ongoing that is there. And so when we look at the tool here in a minute, you will see various different justifications that we have allowed in a drop-down menu for you to select to hopefully streamline the process for you. And again, the justification to substantiate this request will be reviewed by the state and also by the Department of Education, and we do sign off to provide certain levels of oversight related to these liquidation extension requests. So they are subject to review from the state as well as the federal government, who will ultimately approve or deny of our request. And then with ESSER 3, for any LEAs who did the extension under either ESSER 1 or ESSER 2, you'll see there's an additional question that's added here under ESSER 3, and that is an additional narrative that relates to the acceleration of academic success as it relates to students, including those furthest from opportunity and with the greatest need. So if you think back to what the ESSER 3 statute talks about, it talks about very particular student groups that were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. This narrative question here harkens back ultimately to those particular student groups and to learning loss and academic success related to those particular student groups. So you will have to write out a narrative justification here for how does extending this particular contract or these particular contracts, how is it going to contribute to the acceleration of academic success for those particular students, and especially including those that were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. That's what this particular question is looking at. So there is an additional narrative. Again, the narrative doesn't have to be incredibly long, but it does have to be substantial enough where we are able to say, yes, this is a sufficient narrative to justify this particular request. Because again, the state will take this information and we will ultimately craft a statewide narrative justification related to our overall state of Texas request for the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. So it has to be more than just a few words. It generally needs to be a few sentences to a paragraph or more to really justify why and how this is going to actually contribute to academic success for those particular student groups. This is a little different than what we've seen under ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, but you will need to write that and it will be looked at because, again, we will collect all that information and we will ultimately submit that to the Department of Education at the state level. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the slides for a second. I'm going to pop up really quick the actual smart sheet, and we're going to walk through the smart sheet here and going to talk through. It's going to be kind of a little bit of rehash of what we've talked about here, but you're actually going to be able to see the form and the different things that are required related to those forms. All right. So this is the actual dynamic view that you are going to see in the ESSER compliance work app. This dynamic view is under the LEA view. Under that compliance work app, it's towards the bottom of the list. You are going to see your LEA listed. So this is a demo account that we have where we just have our LEA listed. You're going to go in and you're going to see that any LEA who received ESSER 3 funds is automatically in the system with a status of not needed. We wanted to put everybody into the system to allow it to be easy for folks to access. The status we'll talk about here at the top, because we will want you to update your status to give us an idea of folks that are actively working towards submitting this by November 30th, when the actual submission for the liquidation extension is due. So you'll see, I'll zoom in here a little bit, make it a little bit easier for y'all to see, is that the status for every district, unless your district went in there and currently changed it, is currently sitting at not needed. What we're asking for is if your district is actively going to be pursuing the liquidation extension under ESSER 3, we ask that you come in here and you change the status to in progress, and you'll be able to save that. This will give us an idea of folks that we need to start talking to, providing technical assistance and guidance as they're walking through this particular process, and will give us an idea kind of the amount of LEAs that we're going to be looking at that are going to be pursuing the liquidation extension under ESSER 3. Again, we generally anticipate a higher number of LEAs that are going to be needing this. And we kind of want to just get ahead of that and get an indication of how many, because in the month of December, after y'all submitted this, myself and my staff potentially could be reaching out to your LEAs asking for additional information and clarification as we look to submit this to the Department of Education by the end of December. So be on standby in December after you submit this to us late November. If we have any questions or we need to clarify anything that you have entered into the actual submission tool itself, just so that we're clear and we have the proper information to submit to the Department of Education by the end of December. You're going to see we pre-populate your LEA name and the CDN, and then we have some general instructions here. One of the big kind of call outs here is to update the status of the actual submission itself so that we know where you're ultimately, if you're looking at it, so we can start to reach out and have those conversations. Many of y'all are not going to be familiar with this particular process, and so we may need to jump on a call with you or email back and forth to answer any questions that y'all may have, or talk with your staff that you're working with, just to make sure that everything's really clear and we're getting the needed information that we have to submit to the Department of Education. You're going to see here that the allocation total is going to be your NOGA amount here. So we're going to go ahead and put in for this particular dynamic view, which is for the ESSER 3 formula fund. This is going to be your NOGA amount. Again, this also does include, if you did get those reallocated funds and you wanted your reallocation amount, this will include those that you accepted here. So it's going to be your total grant award under ESSER 3. And then you're going to see areas that are not grayed out. These are areas that we need and require information from the LEA. So the first is the amount obligated as of September 30th. So this is, again, for those valid legal obligations that you incurred during the period of performance for ESSER 3. That amount goes here, and that's a dollar amount that you will enter into here. The amount liquidated is the amount that you have drawn down or you will draw down by November 15th. This is, again, a dollar amount. The percent liquidated as of November 15th, as well as the balance remaining as of November 15th, these will automatically calculate once you put dollar amounts into the amount obligated line, as well as the amount liquidated line as of November 15th. Then you're going to see the amount of obligated funds needing extension. It's important to note here, as we look at the difference between balance remaining and the amount of obligated funds needing extension, what is listed up here as balance remaining is not necessarily going to match the amount of funds needing the extension. If, for instance, you have a balance remaining here of $100,000 and you only put $90,000 here, what that generally is going to indicate is that your LEA is going to lapse that $10,000 for your ESSER 3 grant award. So it's not assumed that what is remaining out of your grant award is what ultimately is going to need to be extended, because, again, the only things that are able to be extended are those properly obligated goods and services that are contracted, not things like payroll and travel. Then you're going to see use of funds. We went ahead and made this a drop-down menu, and we provide what the Department of Education generally has said is generally what they understand is subject to the liquidation extension. So we have construction contracts, HVAC contracts, air purification contracts, instructional services contracts, any delayed supplies and materials contracts that you might have, as well as other. So other will allow you to put additional information in here. If you simply select just one, like construction contract, you don't need to put anything in this other box here. But if you do select other, we will ask you to indicate what the use of funds is. Again, we may ask some additional questions and get some clarification on this, because, again, we are subject to oversight related to these particular extension requests. We may need to ask additional information if you put in other here. Vendor name, you will need to indicate the name of the vendor associated with those particular use of funds that you indicated above. You're also going to need to indicate the contract number or contract numbers associated with those particular uses of funds. This does open up a little bit of discussion, because certain LEAs that we've worked with under, especially the ESSER 2 liquidation extension, a purchase order is in their local policy the definition of their binding written agreement and their obligation of federal funds. So here you will either put a contract number or a PO number potentially. If you put a PO number down, our staff will reach out and will ask for you to provide your local policy and procedure where it states that the purchase order is the obligation of federal education funds, because generally speaking, what we expect is an signed executed contract. Often purchase orders do not have enough information and do not meet a lot of the federal requirements to be ultimately pass muster on a real valid legal obligation of federal education funds, but we will accept it if your local policy clearly states that a PO is the obligation of federal funds. And then you're going to jump into justification. Again, we have added kind of things that the Department of Education have told us they generally are permissible under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. So you have lack of personnel, lack of bids, procurement delays, services ongoing, ongoing delays, and then we have a other box here as well. Again, if you select other, please do put that justification in there as well about what's the other reason. Generally, from what we've seen under ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 liquidation extension, these general justification things here generally cover, these examples generally cover most of what LEAs would tell us their justification ultimately is. And so you will pick one of these options, or you will select other, and you will indicate what that other justification is. There is a spot for you to give us any other notes. These, you can enter information in here as you deem necessary. It's not required to put anything into these other subrecipient specific data notes section. If you have anything that you want to tell our department office about related to your overall request, you would indicate that here in this particular note section. But if you don't have anything to add, leave it blank and move on. And then you're going to see that acceleration of academic success for students section here. Again, this is that narrative ultimately describing how this request will contribute to the acceleration of academic success for students, including those that are furthest from opportunity and with the greatest need. The Department of Education did indicate some examples which are highlighted here in this particular help text related to this question. You can take a look at those. Generally speaking, we're expecting 3 to 4 sentences here. It needs to be substantive enough to show and tie back to this particular use of funds or those uses of funds that you're looking for to be covered under the liquidation extension. How is it going to contribute to that acceleration of academic success? So that needs to be relatively substantive. A few words and a couple of sentences probably is not going to ultimately cut it. We're going to need a little bit more than that when you look at what we generally assess the Department of Ed is looking for here. And then once you're done with this, you'll be able to click these 3 boxes and make sure once you've submitted everything, you've checked all these assurances, you've filled out all of this information that's required here, we ask that you go up here to complete it and hit complete it, submit to TEA. That's going to indicate to us that you think that you are done with your overall submission. It's going to trigger myself and my staff to go start working and looking and reviewing these as they're coming into the state. We haven't had anyone actually submit any of these under the formula grants for ESSER 3 yet. We've had quite a few under the discretionary project, one which we'll talk about here in just a second. But once you're completed, please turn that status over to completed. We will reach out to you if we need you to add additional information, if we need to clarify information related to your overall request. One of the things that you will see in this actual dynamic view is there are no fields are ultimately required with that kind of red asterisk that you're used to in Smartsheet, because we needed to give you the flexibility to update and change your status without having to complete the form in its totality. So this allows you to change the statuses, to put information in here, save it, and come back to it later. But once you flip it over to complete it, submit to TEA, we'll take it from there. We will reach out if we need anything, and we'll try and give you an indication if we've accepted ultimately what you've provided to, and that'll probably come in December. You will get a general notice from us saying we've accepted your request, and we will now be submitting that to the Department of Education. And so you'll get some kind of indication from the state. We talk about the other form, right? So this form covers the ESSER 3 formula grant. This other form in the ESSER compliance work app covers the other discretionary projects. So this is going to be our homeless, E-class, and other ESSER 3 grant projects for districts and service centers across the state. So you'll see we don't pre-populate anything here because we need to allow you the flexibility to enter your information for those various projects, and we couldn't pre-populate everything into Smartsheet related to those numerous projects, discretionary projects under ESSER 3. You're going to see that you're going to need to indicate your LEA name and CDN. You'll need to select that here from the drawdown. You're going to put a name of the authorized representative requesting approval. You're going to pick which ESSER 3 project you are submitting for. So we've indicated the general kind of larger ESSER 3 discretionary project where we would anticipate both LEAs and service centers may need to apply for the liquidation extension, again, for those properly obligated contracted services. But we did also include an other, our ESSER 3 funded grant program that's not listed in that list I just showed. You are going to need to indicate that other ESSER 3 grant project here. You will need to put the name of that project here. Then you need to put your allocation total. So this is your NOGA amount for that particular project is what you're going to put here. And then generally the same information as the formula dynamic view that we just looked at. Amount obligated as of September 30th. Amount that you've liquidated as of November 15th. This percentage in balance remaining will automatically calculate once you hit save here at the end. The amount of funds necessitating the extension, the use of funds, you'll still need the vendor name, the contract numbers, the justification. We do allow you, again, if you have any other notes that you need to tell us about, we allow for you to enter that here. And again, the narrative here for the acceleration of academic success for students, again, expecting 3 to 4 sentences to really substantiate this. Once you've submitted everything, you'll check these 3 boxes and submit all the other required, enter in information into all of the other required fields. And then you'll hit save, and that's going to submit it to the state, and we get notified of when you submit that, and then we will process it. If there are questions related to it, we will reach out, either myself or members of my team will reach out to you and get additional information and clarify different pieces that you submitted under with your particular submission, either under the ESSER 3 formula, that form, or under this form for those other ESSER 3 discretionary projects. So that is the live demo of the form. These are both live currently on the ESSER compliance work app. They've been live since about June 27th when we put that TAA letter out is when these ultimately went live. So they are there. Everything is there for your district to be able to go ahead and start submitting information if you're going to need the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. I'm going to stop sharing these smart sheets and jump back into the slideshow real quick. And then we will take some questions. Should have time for questions here at the end. All right. So how do you access the extension form? So y'all, all registered folks will get a copy of these slides that I'll send out probably early next week. You'll get a copy of these slides. You will do this through the ESSER compliance work app. Everything generally is enumerated in that June 27th TAA letter. And again, we've pre-populated fields where we can. We've put in information related to that there. And we have generally kind of laid out everything in this TAA letter. But again, it would probably be good for you to jump into that compliance work app. Go ahead and take a look at that. If you have any particular questions, my contact information will be at the end if you have any questions related to those overall submission forms. So I want to talk about, let's just theorize that you submit the ESSER 3 liquidation extension, everything's good, the state submits it, and the Department of Education says, yep, we approve these under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. Now what? Kind of what happens after that? So it's important to keep in mind that the end of the standard liquidation is December 28th of this year, right? So ultimately what's going to happen is the month of January ultimately is going to be a period in which we are waiting at the state level, and you are going to be waiting for notification that the Department of Education has approved of the state's overall request under ESSER 3. So during that month of January and potentially into early February, we're kind of in this blackout period where we don't know if we're actually going to be approved under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. We've been approved under ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 with great luck. We really don't anticipate much different under ESSER 3, but there's always the potential that the Department of Education asks additional questions, and that prolongs when we get official approval from the Fed. And so because of that, we generally say about the first to second week in February, we should be able to give you notice that you've been approved under the ESSER 3 liquidation extension. But during the month of January, you're not going to be able to draw down funds in the ER system because we close your grant award because we're past the end of the standard liquidation period. But when you are approved under the extension, we give you that notice, we reopen your grant award in ER, and you're still going to be able to come in and draw down funds again for those contracts that you put under the liquidation extension. So you'll get a letter. This letter was the letter that we sent for folks under ESSER 2, be a very similar letter with the information changed for ARP ESSER 3, as well as any of those particular discretionary projects. You will still come in and submit during this liquidation extension period drawdown requests in ER. You will still complete the state fiscal report with each of those drawdowns. When you initiate that drawdown, it's under manual review, meaning it's not going to automatically pass all of our budget checks and automatically reimburse you. It manually goes through multiple layers because the state is responsible for oversight of these extension requests, so everything is on manual review. So we get your request, you fill out the state fiscal report, my staff get notified of a drawdown request. We will send you a smart sheet asking for additional information to substantiate what you are requesting the drawdown for. On your first drawdown, we will need a copy of your contracts or your agreements. We're also going to require you to provide supporting documentation such as invoices that show what you're charging and what you're drawing down under the liquidation extension. And again, we have to be able to see the tie of that drawdown back to those contracts that you indicated in your ESSER 3 liquidation extension submission. We have to see that clear tie to make sure that it is allowable for us to say, yep, we can request that from the Fed. If there's any questions throughout this process, my staff or staff in our department will reach out to you and work through that. And eventually it kind of becomes clockwork as you make those drawdowns of what's required. Again, after we approve everything, go through our process internally, we do manually request those from the Department of Education. Our general goal to process these is 3 to 5 business days. When we request money from the Fed, it depends on when we're actually going to receive it. So if you're expecting a relatively quick reimbursement after you make the drawdown, might be a little bit more delayed because it is all manual throughout the process. So you just need to be mindful of that as you're planning forward on these particular drawdowns. This is the general information that we will require you to submit with those particular drawdown requests under the liquidation extension. Pretty basic for the most part, but you will be required to submit that supporting documentation so that when staff review it, we can very clearly show that it's tying back to that contract or those contracts that you have under the liquidation extension, either for the ESSER 3 formula or for those discretionary grants. For those discretionary grants, you will submit a drawdown for each of those, meaning you will submit these smart sheet forms multiple times. So if you do a drawdown for, let's just say for ARP Homeless, as well as your ESSER 3 formula grants, you will have to submit this smart sheet for both your ARP Homeless drawdown, as well as your ESSER 3 formula drawdown, because we have to kind of track all of those projects separately between formula and all of the other discretionary projects. But again, you'll generally get in the habit of what we require. And if there's any questions, we will work with you throughout this process. So this is my contact information. If you have any questions regarding this, please feel free to reach out. Also, feel free to reach out to your ESC contacts as well. They've generally got a lot of this information, can help you navigate through this particular process. And again, we do anticipate a lot more LEAs needing this under ESSER 3, especially kind of looking at how much money we have statewide. We're here to guide you and work with you through this because this is great flexibility. There's just some caveats and some nuances of things that we have to work through with LEAs. So we will work with you through that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to open up the Q&A.